Welcome to Stealing from Wizards Volume 1, Pickpocketing, by R.A. Consul, read by the author. Chapter 5, The Principal and the Hound. Kuro was lost in nightmares. They were all the usual ones: the night of the Hound raid, the death of Helena, a string of punishments each more painful than the last. But something was different this time. In each, Talon Dubois was standing in the background with a cold, grim expression, watching Kuro suffer. Also, he couldn't wake up. Normally, one nightmare would shake him from his sleep, but this time he just drifted from one terrible memory to another, unable to wake. Kuro wondered if he had died, if this was the hell that Father John had warned him about. He would be trapped reliving the worst parts of his life over and over with Talon Dubois as his personal devil. Memories of the chase with Dubois and the fight with his church invaded his dreams, and the recollection of the shock he'd received woke him with a start. He immediately regretted waking. His chest felt as though it had a stake driven through it, and every muscle in his body cried out at the idea of moving. He lay still for a long time, silently ranking the after effects of electrocution against his other miseries. He decided it ranked close to hot oil burns in things he should never experience again. After much deliberation as to whether he wanted to see where he was, he decided to force his eyes open. As he did, the pitch blackness in the unfamiliar room around him slowly brightened, with a dull, flat light, which seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. He climbed stiffly from the cot on which he had been left, and it sank into the stone floor. Gray, who was there also and had not finished sleeping, hissed at the floor for swallowing her mattress. Kuro scanned the room for hiding places or exits, but found none. The room was entirely empty, with no doors or windows. The granite slabs that made up the walls were so neatly carved that he could barely see the seams between them. He was trapped. There was no place to run and no place to hide. His shoes were gone, his pockets emptied. This was undoubtedly a cell in Niflheim prison. This empty stone box was probably where Kuro would spend the rest of his life. He started to panic, but a voice from behind him turned that panic into anger. "Good morning," it said cheerfully. "You all right?" Kuro spun to face the owner of the voice. It was Dubois, smiling patronizingly down at him. He had entered through a gap that had opened in one wall and was sealing itself again behind him. "Can I get you anything?" he offered. "Are you hungry?" Kuro said nothing. He just stared at the ground. He had heard about this sort of thing from Phineas. Hounds would sometimes pretend to be friendly. They would try to earn your trust so you would tell them things that you shouldn't. Kuro was not going to fall for it. Dubois sighed. "Well, I'm starving. I had a long night, you see. Trip to the hospital, mountains of paperwork, had to write a formal apology to the Undead Ecclesiastical Society. Some kid knocked me through the roof and a cat bit me in the face. My wife is gonna kill me." He laughed and winced a little. He wore bandages on his face and hand. Kuro couldn't help but feel a little bit satisfied that the Hound hadn't made it out unscathed. "You know, you gave me quite a chase. You're harder to catch than a pixie in a hurricane." When Kuro was unmoved by Dubois' attempts at a compliment, he changed tack. "I ended up missing the match last night. I'm told it was a good one. Do you follow lacrosse?" Kuro considered for a long time if he should answer Dubois at all. Saying nothing would surely make Kuro look guilty, but it kept him from saying anything that might expose Phineas. If he pretended to cooperate, however, he might be let go. Besides, all of his orders were meant to keep Phineas from being found. He'd already failed in that regard. In all likelihood, Kuro's master was in a cell like this, right next to him. "I don't know who that is," Kuro said honestly after a long pause, though he would have said the same even if he did know this lacrosse person. "I don't follow people." "What?" Dubois replied as his face contorted in confusion. "No, look, lacrosse. Lacrosse," he repeated as though the name would suddenly start to mean something to Kuro. "Have you seriously never heard of lacrosse?" Kuro had rattled the Hound. He considered it a victory. Likely his last, so he savored it. Dubois scowled and ordered Kuro to sit down. Kuro was confused for a moment at the instruction to sit. The room was devoid of furnishing. When he turned to where Dubois was gesturing, however, he found that 2 wooden chairs with green leather seats had appeared along with a large, heavy, well-worn desk. The Hound sat behind the desk and motioned for Kuro to sit opposite him. Dubois pulled a steaming cup of coffee from one of the drawers and took a long, slow slurp while he waited for Kuro to get settled. Kuro tried very hard to find the chair rigid and unyielding, but it was unrelentingly comfortable. He assumed it was enchanted, probably forcing him to be comfortable so he would let down his guard. Gray didn't help the situation. Having noticed a warm lap on which to sleep, she'd immediately leapt onto Kuro and curled up, making it impossible for him to shift into a less comfortable position. "Let's start again," Dubois said warmly. "Do you know who I am?" "You're the dread wolf, Lugarot," replied Kuro, trying to keep his voice from quivering in fear. Some of the false friendliness drained from Dubois. He seemed unfond of the titles. "I've been called that by some, yes," he said, looking quizzically at Kuro as if trying to read his mind. "I'm Talon Dubois, Knight Commander of the Royal Guard. And you are?" Silence. "Look," Dubois changed strategies transparently, and his stern expression turned into one of sympathy. "I'd like to help you here, but I don't know how unless you tell me. Just give me something to work with. Where do you live?" Kuro just stared at the floor. "Where are your parents? Can I at least tell them that you're all right?" Kuro kept his mouth sealed. Dubois slumped, defeated. "Okay, I didn't want to do this, but you've forced my hand." He opened a shallow drawer and pulled out his overstuffed manila envelope and slammed it on the desk. He flipped it open and tossed Kuro a small scrap of paper from the top of the stack. "I owe you 1 silver crown and 3 nickels. Kuro broke out in a sweat, although the room was quite cool. He felt his face flush. Dubois leaned in and looked very sternly at Kuro. "There are nearly 50 reports in here of minor thefts in the Bytown market, all with the same calling card, an IOU with a picture of a winking weasel." Kuro almost corrected him, but managed to keep quiet. Dubois started flipping through the seemingly endless file. "The same card seems to appear in a dozen other places around the realm, from Saguenay up in Alfheim to Camelot down in Tiernanog." Talon continued to sort through the pile of notes. "There were some found outside the Vale, too, from a cake shop in Vancouver to a pizzeria in Halifax. What kind of thief steals sandwiches and candlesticks and leaves apologies?" Kuro felt very small in front of the looming Hound and his pile of evidence. "Do you want to know what my staff have put together?" Dubois dug out a typed report from the pile and began to read. "The trivial nature of the crimes indicates an individual stealing for fun or practice. The distribution of incidents indicates a resident or frequent visitor to Bytown, but capable of rapid travel, likely owns a high-performance broom or carpet. The frequency of the crimes indicates a pathological need for theft or mischief, and the sophistication necessary to carry them out indicates a wizard with a deep mastery of charms and illusions, particularly those related to deception and beguilement as evidenced by the inconsistent witness accounts. Combined with the above evidence and given the mucilid nature of the signature, current primary suspect..." Dubois paused for effect and to survey his captive. "Sir Randolph Martin, minstrel and consort of the Spring Queen." Kuro exploded with laughter. He knew he'd given himself away, but he couldn't help it. He was both flattered and delighted by the idea of his crimes being pinned on some famous nobleman. Dubois was not laughing, though. He tossed the papers aside. "Some very clever people came up with that. They're quite convinced that one would have to be a very skilled sorcerer indeed to rob so many witches and wizards without getting caught. I almost believed it. But Randolph is more likely to put something unexpected into your pocket than to take something out. Anyway, that's why I was in the market that night. I was there to buy Randolph around at the pub and ask him about it. But then I found you." Dubois' gold, predatory eyes seemed to see right into Kuro's mind. A skinny little street rat, quick as lightning, quiet as a mouse, knows all the secret places of Detritus Lane, seems to be quite protective of one of the only 2 shops in Bytown Market that haven't filed a complaint, and was wearing these. Talon retrieved a pair of sneakers from his desk and slid them towards Kuro. "Those are mine," snapped Kuro, furious that they had been taken from him. He was shocked at his own outburst, that those shoes were worth shouting at a hound over. "I know," Dubois replied. "I didn't steal them," said Kuro, grabbing them off the table and clutching them to his chest. "They were a gift." "I believe you." Dubois seemed genuine. "Who gave them to you?" "Mr. Schumacher," Kuro mumbled. "Why?" "I don't know." "Is that why you stopped the burglars?" Dubois had clearly put all the pieces together before the conversation had even started. Kuro nodded. Dubois' warm smile returned but seemed more genuine than before. Mr. Schumacher was proud as punch when I told him what you'd done, including the part where you tackled me out of the air. He insists that you're a fine boy, not a criminal bone in your body. Father John, too, screams the same. I'm inclined to believe them. I'm happy to let my people continue to monitor Sir Martin, even if they do come back glowing purple or inflated or desperately infatuated with an umbrella. But Dubois paused, and his look turned menacing again. I could look a little closer at these reports, and you might end up in front of a formal tribunal and on your way for an extended stay somewhere unpleasant. Do you understand? So, if I tell you, Kuro shrank down into his chair and pulled Gray closer to him, then I won't have to stay in Niflheim? Dubois looked horrified at the suggestion. Niflheim? No, not Niflheim. Never Niflheim. That's for real monsters, murderers and the like, not petty thieves and street rats or weasels. But Kuro started looking around at the polished stone walls. Aren't we in Niflheim now? Dubois laughed mockingly. Of course not. This is my office in the Granite Citadel. With a wave of his hand, a window carved itself into one wall and a door into the opposite. Paintings melted out of the wall and a bookshelf slid up through the floor. Dubois stood and hung his heavy long green uniform coat on a rack that appeared for the purpose. I just hid everything away while you were sleeping in case your cat decided to make a mess of things. Or you thought a 60-story fall out of my window sounded like a good idea. Kuro dared to look out the window. He definitely wasn't on a frozen island prison in the far north. He was still in Bytown. The Granite Citadel, home of the Royal Guard, sat on a hill at the center of the city, a towering stone obelisk of black and gray that could be seen from any part of town. If Kuro craned his neck, he could see the Bytown market, a tiny circle in the distance, the people so small as to look like motes of dust floating through it. Not being in Niflheim was a relief, but the Citadel was hardly much better. One wrong word and he'd never see the light of day again. That is, if his fate hadn't already been decided and this was just a play for more information. So what do you say? Asked Dubois, as he relaxed back into his chair and slurped his coffee. Can you be honest with me? Kuro thought hard for a moment. He considered how honest the Hound might be. He might still be lying, but then again, the Hounds had much more effective methods of getting information if they wanted to. It's a cat, Kuro said at last. Dubois looked at one of Kuro's notes and squinted a little. Kuro held up Gray for comparison, and Dubois grinned broadly in understanding. Nah, it's definitely a weasel. He winked as he said it and shoved the whole massive file back in the drawer. Can we start again? Kuro nodded. What's your name? Kuro. Last name? I don't have any other names. Where are your parents? I don't have any. So you're an orphan, or a stray? Dubois asked in a sad and sympathetic tone. No, I don't have any parents. The Hound scrutinized Kuro. Who raised you then? Kuro almost spoke, but his jaw slammed shut on his tongue as he nearly said his master's name. He was not permitted to even think it, let alone speak it. He had very nearly disobeyed an order. What are you doing? He demanded. Kuro pried his jaw open, his tongue throbbing. Nothing, he said. Good grief, you're bleeding. Why did you do that? It seemed odd that Dubois would need to ask that. Surely he'd seen someone try to disobey their master in his line of work. He probably just didn't know what Kuro's offense had been. Of course, Kuro couldn't explain, as that would be a much worse offense than he'd just committed. I have to, was all that Kuro offered in explanation. Dubois' brow furrowed, and he examined Kuro as if he were reading a complicated document. He rummaged in one of the drawers of his desk, which was clearly much larger than it appeared from the outside. He nearly had to crawl inside to find what he was looking for. He emerged, holding a small bottle of red liquid. He pulled the stopper and moved around the desk to Kuro. Hold out your hand, he instructed. Kuro hesitantly stretched out his arm for the Hound, who allowed a single drop of the potion to drip from the bottle onto Kuro's hand. The moment it touched his skin, it burst violently into a puff of black smoke, leaving behind a small, sooty mark. Curious, Dubois said to himself. He seemed to have forgotten that Kuro was listening. Very odd. Dubois wandered back to his chair, deep in thought. After staring at his steepled fingers for a few moments, he looked up and noticed that Kuro was still in the room. Wait here for a moment, he said, as if Kuro had a choice. He walked out of the room and it sealed itself behind him. The window and the door closed over again with stone, and all the furnishings other than Kuro's chair retreated into the floor. For several minutes, Kuro sat in confused and frightened silence. The only sound was the gentle purring of Gray, who had slept the entire exchange. Gray did not sleep through what happened next. A loud clattering noise behind him made Kuro jump out of his seat, sending Gray flying. Kuro spun and tried to hide behind the chair, but found it had already gone. An ancient-looking wizard in white robes and a stained leather apron was shuffling in through the new door in the other wall, leaning heavily on a gnarled old staff. A cart full of magical implements wheeled itself along behind him. He was so old and withered that his wrinkles had their own wrinkles, and his jowls and earlobes drooped down nearly to meet his collar. On his cart were strangely curled special-use wands, gruesome-looking metal tools inlaid with runes and crystals, and dozens of small potions that smoked and bubbled in their poorly sealed bottles. The old wizard fixed one eye on Kuro, while the other seemed more intent on keeping the contents of the cart in check.
"Up on the examining table, if you please," the wizard wheezed, as he indicated a long, high, padded table that had wandered in while Kuro wasn't looking in its direction.
Kuro did not please. He dove under the table, trying to keep its legs between him and the wizard with a cart full of torture tools.
"Oh, for goodness sake, Talon! I haven't time for this. Please restrain your prisoner," said the ancient wizard.
"He's not my prisoner." Dubois appeared behind Kuro and grabbed him by the shoulders before he had a chance to react. "He's my guest." Dubois wasn't a burly man, but he was surprisingly strong. Kuro struggled fruitlessly in his grip as he was lifted from under the table and plunked unceremoniously on top of it. "If I'm your guest," Kuro begged, "then I'd like to leave." Dubois did not loosen his grip. After a contemplative pause, he conceded the point. "I suppose you are my prisoner then. Please act like it for a few minutes and do what you're told." The examiner poked and prodded Kuro with his many instruments, then stared at him through oddly shaped, colored crystals. He placed drops of an assortment of foul-smelling potions very precisely on locations around Kuro's body. Between his two smallest toes on his left foot, inside his right nostril, under each of his fingernails, and just beneath one of his shoulder blades. They variously smoked, sizzled, and tingled. The tests were much less invasive than those Phineas had done, and Kuro wondered what the mage could possibly learn from such trivial experiments. At one moment in the examination, the old wizard had pointed his gnarled staff in Kuro's direction, and it had taken several minutes for Dubois to coax him back out from under the table. Nothing good had ever come from someone pointing a stick at Kuro, and he had grown more than a little jumpy around them. Throughout the examination, the old wizard muttered to himself. It started with, "How curious," moved on to, "Curiouser and curiouser," and concluded with, "Well, now, that is curious." Kuro's fear had turned towards annoyance by the end of the examination, a feeling apparently shared by Dubois. "What, if you please, Mr. Jellicoe, is so terribly curious?" Dubois demanded, finally losing his patience. One of the old examiner's eyes stopped scrutinizing Kuro and wandered over to meet Dubois' impatient glare. "This," he said, pointing at Kuro as if that were an adequate explanation. "Some more detail, if you please." Dubois rolled his eyes. It was becoming clear to Kuro that this was not the first such interaction the Hound had suffered through. "Oh, it's a boy," Mr. Jellicoe said. "Around 12 years old, moderately malnourished, rather small for his age. Brown eyes, brown hair, unusually large ears. Also," the examiner paused to check Kuro over again, "he's cursed." "I already know all of that," said Dubois, his fingers tapping on the table impatiently. "What kind of curse?" "Oh, I don't know," said Mr. Jellicoe. "I've not seen one quite like it. It's thick as tar and runs right down to the bone. It's like he's been stewed in it." He seemed sort of delighted by the fact, as if he just found a new flavor of ice cream that he'd never tried before. "No," he corrected. "More like the curse came first and he was grown around it." "Can you remove it?" "Oh, yes," Mr. Jellicoe replied, nodding vigorously, which made his wrinkles and droopy face flap about. "But it would almost certainly kill him." Kuro returned to hiding under the table, and Dubois buried his face in his hands. "Is the curse dangerous?" he pleaded with the ancient wizard. "Only to him, I believe." Both of the ancient examiner's eyes returned to Kuro, who was peering back up at him from beneath the examining bench. He looked Kuro over once more through some tinted lenses. "Yes, I'm sure of it. No sign of leakage at all." "Is there anything we can do for him?" Dubois asked.
Oh, perhaps give him some bananas, Mr. Jellicoe said absently. He has a potassium deficiency.
Dubois buried his face in his palm. The curse. Do we have any way of knowing what this curse does, why it's there?
Mr. Jellicoe pondered for a moment, his eyes wandering independently as he thought. Have you tried asking the child? Dubois sighed in defeat and looked down at Kuro quizzically. Kuro looked back blankly. If he was cursed, Phineas had never told him, but it's not as though his master had been very forthcoming with information. Maybe some of the experiments Phineas had done were curses. If so, Kuro hadn't noticed any changes or long-lasting ill effects of them. Dubois thanked the old wizard as politely as he could and waved him off. Mr. Jellicoe bowed slightly before he and his cart disappeared through the far wall. Dubois, seeming not to realize he was speaking out loud, said in an exasperated tone, "Why is it that all of the most brilliant wizards are completely useless?" He shook his head and turned to Kuro. "I'm sorry about that," he said. He looked Kuro up and down a few times, screwing up his face as if thinking very hard. "I need to go and send some letters. Can I do anything for you before I go?" Kuro asked hopefully, "Could you leave the window there where you go?" Dubois arched an eyebrow. "Will you try to escape?" There was an overly long pause before Kuro replied. "Yes," he admitted. "Right. How about I just send up some furniture and breakfast?" A sofa and a pair of armchairs materialized shortly after Dubois had left. A few minutes after that, the door reappeared and a short table walked itself in, laden with food. Kuro was very suspicious of the lot. The sofa and the chairs looked extremely well worn and comfortable. They seemed like they belonged in someone's study, not in a prisoner's cell. They were plush and velvety and warm. The breakfast had enough food to feed a family. There was French toast, eggs, sausages, and back bacon, a pile of different jams and syrup, and a whole bunch of bananas. Kuro was very nearly able to resist the allure of it all, but his companion betrayed him and shattered his resolve. Gray pounced on the table and stole a glistening piece of bacon, which he dragged into an armchair and began to tear at lazily, purring loudly. Kuro, unable to resist any longer, grabbed a sausage and joined his cat on the oversized chair. "If this is poisoned, I'm blaming you," he said between mouthfuls. If the food was poisoned, it was only with the mildest of sleeping powders. After stuffing himself fuller than he could ever remember being, Kuro felt very drowsy. He curled up in the velvet cushions of the armchair and drifted off into sleep. Kuro was awoken by a nightmare, the usual one with Helena's desperate eyes begging him to save her. He sat up quickly and found, rather painfully, that he was no longer in the chair. He had moved to a safer place in his sleep and was underneath the couch, clinging to a velour throw pillow. He rubbed the painful spot on his forehead where he had slammed it against the wooden frame under the couch and began to crawl out, stopping partway when someone entered the room. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Principal McCutcheon," he heard Dubois say. "I hope this won't take very long, Mr. Dubois," replied an unfamiliar woman's voice. She sounded very impatient. "This is a very busy time of year. School starts next week." "I know, and I'm sorry, Principal, but that's exactly why it was so urgent. You see, I have a favor to ask." "I do not appreciate the military meddling in school affairs," the woman snapped. "It's not the military at all. Think of it as a personal favor to me." Dubois tried to pacify her with a casually friendly tone, but it wasn't working. "A personal favor to a knight commander of the Royal Guard is the very definition of the military meddling." Kuro poked his head out from under the sofa to get a look. The woman was a middle-aged witch with a long black skirt, with a tweed jacket over a white blouse that had a collar so stiff it could stop an axe. She had black hair streaked with gray, all pulled back tightly into a bun, which emphasized the severe look on her face. She wore cat's-eye glasses, which further enhanced the sternness of her features. Her gray eyes were cold as stone, and her lips were so pursed they looked like a raisin. Dubois, nearly a head taller than she, seemed small and childlike in her presence. "Now please tell me what this is all about so I can get back to Avalon," she demanded. "Of course, I'd like to introduce you to the young Mr. Kuro." The Hound waved his hand and the furniture disappeared, leaving Kuro exposed and looking very silly, lying on the stone floor. "Kuro, I'd like you to meet Ms. McCutcheon, principal at Avalon Academy's junior high school." "Hello," said Kuro as politely as he could to a patch of stone slightly in front of the principal's feet. He climbed to his feet and bowed slightly. He had the unpleasant feeling that he'd seen the woman somewhere before. "Pleased to meet you."
the principal replied without the slightest hint of the claimed pleasure. She looked down her nose at him and eyed him suspiciously. He's a ward of the state and just turned 12. I'm hoping you have a place at Avalon for him, Dubois said plainly. Principal McCutcheon turned her suspicious gaze to Dubois. That's all there is to it, then? Called me all the way to Bytown for a late edition? The head of the Hounds visibly squirmed under the withering gaze of Avalon's principal. Well, yes, he replied. I do not enjoy being deceived, Talon Dubois. The woman's lips had become so pursed that they threatened to disappear. He does have some special circumstances, Dubois admitted. I was planning to tell you in private, but... He is a thief, she cut him off mid-sentence. Dubois was caught very much off guard. How? Why do you say that? Ms. McCutcheon drew a scrap of paper from her pocket and passed it to Dubois. I owe you 2 black buttons and 1 hard-boiled egg. Kuro cringed. He knew she seemed familiar. She had been eating lunch on a bench with another woman in Moncton. She'd had buttons in her pouch instead of coins like normal people. He'd needed them, so he had kept them. What makes you think he has anything to do with this? Dubois asked, avoiding her gaze. Because he happens to be wearing the buttons. She scowled at them both. It was true and terribly obvious. 2 large black buttons were mixed among other light brown ones that held his shirt closed. How do you know those are yours? Dubois posed innocently. Because, Mr. Dubois, they are not buttons. The woman had become so cross that Kuro was worried she might burst. Instead, she mumbled a short melody of words and snapped her fingers. Kuro froze, expecting the worst. He tensed his body and clamped his eyes shut in anticipation of pain. The worst did not come, however. All that happened was that the 2 buttons liberated themselves from his shirt and fell to the floor with a soft but weighty thud. Kuro risked a peek. The buttons were gone. They had transformed into a large leather-bound ledger and a handbag. The principal swept over and reclaimed her borrowed goods. Both Kuro and Dubois looked extremely guilty and tried to look anywhere but at Ms. McCutcheon. Kuro was the first to break the silence. I'm sorry, he said. I don't have the egg anymore. I ate it. The principal's expression softened very slightly at this. You may find this hard to believe, young man, but it is not you with whom I am disappointed. She rounded on the Hound. Come, Mr. Dubois, you have a great deal of explaining to do. At that, they both vanished through a wall, and Kuro was left staring at Gray in a completely empty room. It was difficult to measure time with no sun or shadows or clocks. It seemed like an eternity passed by, then backed up and took another pass for good measure. Kuro spent the time sitting on the floor, talking to Gray, who, being unable to hear him, had fallen fast asleep in his lap. Well, at least you're comfortable, Kuro grumbled. Eventually, Principal McCutcheon and Dubois reappeared behind him, giving him quite the start when Ms. McCutcheon cleared her throat to get his attention. The principal approached Kuro with stiff formality and handed him an envelope of weighty, expensive paper with a red wax seal. On it was written his name in large, crisp letters. The principal cleared her throat again and pronounced, I would like to formally accept you into the junior high school of Avalon Academy. Kuro wasn't entirely sure what was going on, but he was certain that Avalon was better than Niflheim Prison, so he went along. Thank you, Principal, ma'am. He bowed awkwardly, unsure of the correct thing to do in situations like these. The formalities concluded, Ms. McCutcheon's expression darkened. I should warn you, Kuro. We do not tolerate theft, criminal behavior, or rule-breaking of any kind at Avalon. Dubois made a strange noise as if gagging or holding in a sneeze. The principal shot him a dark glare, but continued. You will be on your best behavior, or you shall find yourself right back here with a sizable criminal record for which you will be answering. Do I make myself clear? Yes, ma'am. Kuro could never meet people's eyes, but he found he could do little more than stare at his own shoes when addressing Ms. McCutcheon. There was something absolutely crushing about the weight of the woman's gaze. Very good. I shall see you at the school next week. She turned and wandered off through the wall. Kuro blinked, and she was gone. Once she had left, Dubois burst with excitement. He clapped Kuro on the back. Oh, that's brilliant. Congratulations. You are gonna love Avalon. Kuro severely doubted that. He had met people from Avalon, and they were dreadful. Worse than that, he would now be one of them. He was a student.
Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.